I awoke in a cell. No bars, no doors, just shimmering energy fields crackling with violet light. I groaned as I pushed myself up on shaky arms. The cell was sterile and frigid, its air thick with piss and sweat. My breath fogged faintly in front of me as I scanned the room, and froze when I saw them. 3 figures sat huddled in a far corner. A young man, skeletal and shivering, his ribs jutting beneath paper-thin skin. A young woman with matted blonde hair clinging to her face, her wild eyes bloodshot and darting. And an older man whose gaunt face was carved with despair, his cheeks hollowed by hunger or horror. Another one, the older man rasped without looking up. His voice was dry gravel scraping against stone. The woman lunged forward suddenly, her hands clutching at my shoulders with surprising strength. "Are you okay?" she demanded breathlessly. Did they do something to you?" Her breath reeked of something sour. I opened my mouth to lie or scream or something, but the room tilted violently beneath me before I could form words. I fell down, darkness swallowing me again. Hey, stay with us," the woman urged, her voice sharp and urgent. Her fingers dug into my shoulders, nails caked with grime. My throat burned, raw as if I'd swallowed glass. "What's your name?" she pressed. "I'm Sarah." "Alex," I croaked, the name tearing loose like gravel. Alex." The young man edged closer from the shadows, his naked frame cast jagged shapes on the shimmering energy field behind him. "Welcome to hell," he whispered, his voice frayed at the edges. Sarah, who was also naked, shot him a glare that could have melted steel. "Don't," she hissed through clenched teeth. Turning back to me, her tone softened, though her white eyes stayed wild. "That's Ethan. How long ago were you taken? Do you remember?" I tried to sit up, but the room tilted violently. My skull throbbed in time with the low, insectile hum of the energy field surrounding us. "I don't know," I said finally. "I was closing up the shop, alone. Then there was this light." Alone. The word slithered out of the corner like a snake. A gaunt, naked figure emerged from the gloom. The older man. His sunken eyes burned fever-bright in his skeletal face. "They prefer isolation," he rasped, his voice dry as parchment. "No witnesses, no resistance." Sarah hooked an arm under my back and hauled me upright with uprising strength. The floor beneath us felt spongy, almost alive under my hands. "That's Dr. Reeves," she said curtly, nodding toward him without looking away from me. "He's been here longer than any of us." Reeves barked a laugh, a hollow sound that echoed off the sterile walls. "Longest that we know of," he corrected with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Days, weeks, there's no way to tell." I stared at the energy field encasing us, its violet light casting sickly reflections on the walls around us. "Where are we?" I asked hoarsely. "What do they want?" Ethan hugged his knees tighter, rocking slightly as he muttered under his breath. "They peel you open," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not your body, your mind. They feed horrible things into your mind. Horrible things." Sarah's hand tightened on my arm, steadying me. Her voice dropped to a near whisper as she added, "They test us, probe memories, fears." She glanced at Ethan briefly before continuing, her tone grim but measured. "Though it's not always physical." She tilted her head slightly, revealing a faint scar glinting on her temple, a puckered line that looked fresh. "Our essence," Reeves cut in smoothly, straightening with a scholar's poise despite his filth-streaked skin and hollowed cheeks. "That's what they're after." He gestured vaguely toward the ceiling where shadows slithered like eels in water. "They're harvesters, not of flesh, but of consciousness, neural patterns." He smirked faintly before adding with mock sentimentality, "The soul if you're inclined to poetry." A cold sweat prickled my neck as I processed his words. "But why? What are they?" Reeves leaned forward slightly, his breath smelling more sour than Sarah. His grin widened into something almost feral as he answered, "Interdimensional parasites? Evolutionary collectors? They've outgrown needs and names, boy. He gestured upward again, with one bony hand as if addressing some unseen audience above us. Only curiosity remains. His gaze locked onto mine then, sharp and unrelenting, and he added softly, "And curiosity is endless." The cell fell silent after that. The energy field buzzed louder suddenly, its vibrations rattling in my molars. Sarah didn't let go of my arm. Ethan rocked faster now in his corner, his lips moving soundlessly. I swallowed hard against the dryness in my throat. A scream tore through the walls. A guttural, wet sound, less human than animal. It twisted, writhing into the air like a serrated blade, carving grooves into my nerves. Sarah flinched. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped her own arms now, nails digging half-moons into flesh. "They've taken someone," she whispered. Her voice trembled, betraying the steel in her posture. Ethan froze mid-rock, his gaunt face pressed harder into his knees. "Screaming's bad," he mumbled, voice muffled. "It means they're mining, deeper than memories." I began to ask what he meant, but Dr. Reeves's laugh cut me off. "You'll learn soon enough, Alex," he said, picking at a scab on his wrist as if it were a casual habit. His eyes gleamed with perverse relish. "You're fresh meat. They'll peel you open." "Shut up," Sarah wheeled on him, her voice cracking under pressure. "Ignore him, Alex. He's rotting his own mind in here." Reeves bared yellowed teeth in a grin that was all malice and no mirth. "Rotten? No, girl." He tapped his temple with one bony finger. "Enlightened. They've shown me things. I know lots of things." The scream faded into silence, leaving only the low hum of the energy field vibrating through my chest like a second heartbeat. Suddenly, the energy fields flared, sudden and blinding, its hum spiking into a shriek that rattled my teeth. Violet light flooded the cell, searing my retinas as I shielded my face with trembling hands. The air thickened around me, pressing against my lungs, a subsonic vibration that resonated in my ribs and the marrow of my bones. "They're here," Sarah breathed, backing away instinctively. The field dissolved with a wet, organic schlick. Two figures stepped through, their exoskeletons glistening like oil-like carapaces under the violet glow. Every muscle in my body locked as they loomed closer, their limbs bending in impossible accordion folds. Joints clicked with each step, like breaking bones. One tilted its bulbous head towards me, its cluster of eyes reflecting my face a dozen times. Pale, naked, prey. "No!" Sarah lunged in front of me without hesitation, arms spread wide like a shield. Her scarred temple glistened with sweat under the flickering light. "Take me instead!" The aliens didn't pause or even acknowledge her plea. A needle-tipped appendage rose from its side like a divining rod and pointed directly at me. Its exoskeleton rippled faintly as if alive. Organs beneath pulsed faster. Anticipation. "Alex?" Sarah spun toward me, her voice raw and desperate now. "Don't let them in. Don't give them a path." Before I could respond, or even process her words, an invisible force clamped around my torso like a vice. My breath hitched as my feet left the ground. Gravity itself seemed to recoil from me. My body hung suspended as if plucked from reality by unseen hands. I fainted. I awoke in another room, to an orb hovering inches from my nose. Its surface shimmered mercury bright, but disturbingly organic, quivering like a jellyfish's bell. I tried to step back, but my feet wouldn't move. The floor beneath me had grown viscous, tendrils of warm biomass curling around my ankles like living restraints. Its surface rippled faintly, as if reacting to my breath. Then it flared. Light erupted, a supernova trapped in glass, searing through my eyelids even as I squeezed them shut. Veins painted red against the blackness. My skull throbbed as if it were splitting open. Then it invaded. Memories, not mine, speared into my mind like jagged shards of glass. A woman's blistered hands clawing at a burning doorframe, her skin sloughing away like melted wax. A child's muffled screams bubbling on the water, tiny fists pounding against ice that refused to crack. An old man's bulging eyes as thumbs pressed into his windpipe, the killer's thumbs and mine overlapping in a grotesque fusion. The visions mutated, twisting into something worse. I was the woman now, flames licking at my flesh as it crackled and peeled away. I was the child, lungs flooding with icy water as panic clawed at my chest. I was the murderer, knuckles whitening as I tightened my grip around a stranger's throat. My scream tangled with theirs, a dissonant chorus of agony that reverberated through my skull. No! I raked my fingernails down my face in desperation, trying to flay the horrors out of me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I fought against the tide of alien memories threatening to drown me. And then, a flicker. A different memory. A fracture in the nightmare. My granddad's garage. Oil-stained concrete under my knees, his calloused hand gripping mine, guiding a wrench over rusted bolts that refused to budge. Pressure is just fear leaving the body, kid, he'd said with that cigarette-rasped laugh of his. Now turn. The tang of engine grease filled my nostrils. Sawdust floated lazily in golden shafts of afternoon light streaming through the cracked garage window. His voice was steady and warm, a lifeline pulling me out of the abyss. The orb shuddered, its light dimmed abruptly, spasming like a dying firefly caught in its own glow. The foreign memories recoiled violently, as though scalded by something they couldn't comprehend, something they couldn't mimic, something real. I clung to Granddad's voice like a prayer. Pressures, just fear leaving the body. Turn, turn, turn. I pried my eyes open slowly, blinking away tears that streaked hot down my cheeks. The orb hovered before me for an instant longer, its once brilliant light now reduced to faint flickers rippling weakly across its surface. Then it dissolved into mist, its remnants curled upward like smoke toward the ceiling before vanishing entirely into the cold void of the chamber. My knees buckled beneath me as I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air that felt too thick to breathe properly. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I pressed them against the sticky surface beneath me for support. I fainted again. "Alex?" Sarah was beside me, her hands fluttering over my face like she didn't know where to start. "Look at me. What did they do?" I spat blood and trembled as I pushed myself upright. "They tried to break me," I rasped, my voice grated like sandpaper against raw nerves, but I bared my teeth anyway, a defiance I didn't fully feel. "But they couldn't." Dr. Reeves uncoiled from the shadows like a vulture descending on a carcass. His roomy eyes glistened with something that might have been curiosity or hunger. "They couldn't?" he murmured, creeping closer with slow, deliberate steps. "What did you feed them, boy?" I met his gaze, fists clenching at my sides despite the tremors racking my body. Granddad's wrench-calloused hands itched phantom-like on my palms. "Something they couldn't eat." Reeves's lips twitched into a smile too sharp for his gaunt face, predatory and hungry. "Ah," he breathed softly, almost irreverently. The violet glow of the energy field carved hollows into his cheeks, making him look skeletal, a death's head grin stretched taut over bone. "Then, you're not fresh meat." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that sent chills down my spine. "You're a mirror." He paused just long enough for his words to sink in, before adding with quiet malice, "You best pray they don't enjoy the reflection." Sarah's hands hovered near my shoulders. "What did you see?" she asked finally, her voice frayed and thin. I swallowed hard against the acid rising in my throat. "Memories," I said hoarsely. "I saw a woman being burned in a fire, a child drowning beneath a frozen lake, a man being strangled to death. Then I saw my memories." Dr. Reeves chuckled softly, a sound like kindling crackling in a dying fire. "Connoisseurs of agony," he rasped, steepling his bony fingers under his chin as though offering a prayer to some unseen god. "But they tasted something new, something rancid to their palate. And..." He lurched forward suddenly, shadows pulling in his hollow eye sockets as he hissed, "They gag." I glared at him, fists tightening until my knuckles ached from the strain. "Speak plainly," I growled through gritted teeth. "You bastard." Reeves' grin widened into something grotesque, a yellowed jack-o'-lantern splitting open across his face. "Hope," he said simply, his voice slick with venom and mockery. "To dim, it's a cancer." He tilted his head slightly as if savoring the word before adding, "A splinter." "Shut up," Sarah barked suddenly, her cheeks flushed with fury, or maybe fear, but her stance was steady. Reeves leaned closer still, despite her outburst. "But feed them curiosity." His gaze flicked upward toward the ceiling, where shadows slithered like eels through waterless depths, "and it multiplies." He smiled faintly at some unseen revelation above him. "Like maggots." The walls convulsed violently without warning, bioluminescent veins flaring brighter before dimming again in erratic pulses that painted the cell in sickly hues of violet and plum. The energy field's hum warped into a guttural snarl that vibrated through my teeth and rattled deep in my ribs. Sarah flinched, but didn't back down even as her knuckles whitened where they gripped my arm tightly now, not grounding herself, but anchoring me. "It's just a ship," she said sharply over Ethan's rising whimpers, though her voice wavered at the edges of conviction. Ethan clawed at his scalp with trembling fingers as he rocked harder than before, the motion frantic now rather than rhythmic. "They're here," he moaned under his breath like a mantra spiraling out of control. "In the walls, in the air." The floor undulated faintly beneath us, veins glowing brighter whenever I shifted, a predator tracking prey. "Alex?" Sarah's whisper cut through the oppressive drone. Her hand trembled as she pointed at the floor. I followed her gaze and froze. My shadow was seared into the biomass. The outline of my body smoldered faintly, edges charred as if the ship itself had branded me. "What the hell?" I scrambled back instinctively, my soles sticking to the gummy surface like tar. Reeves weaved out a laugh from his corner, a sound like dry leaves scraping over stone. "A scar," he crooned, his voice almost admiring. "How poetic." "Explain," I snapped, my voice raw with frustration and fear. "You've etched yourself into their hive," he said, tilting his head as though studying a curious specimen. "Now they'll dissect that stubborn little spark in you, cell by cell." The walls rippled violently in response, bioluminescent veins flaring and dimming erratically. The energy field fizzed and spat like an unstable reactor, its hum warping into a guttural snarl that vibrated through my teeth. Static lifted Sarah's hair, strands dancing like black snakes in an unseen storm. "They're coming," she whispered. Ethan moaned from his corner, rocking violently now, his nails raked over his scalp as he muttered incoherently. "Coming, coming, coming." "They can't take him twice," Sarah snapped suddenly, shoving me behind her despite the tremble in her legs. She stood firm, her scarred temple glistening with sweat under the flickering violet glow. The energy field exploded, not violet this time. Red. Crimson light flooded the cell like spilled blood, thick and clinging to every surface. The air reeked of copper and burnt hair, sharp enough to sting my nostrils. The drone deepened into a bass rumble that rattled my ribs. This is new," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the din. Reeves' smirk faltered for the first time since I'd met him, his pupils blue white as he murmured under his breath. "Oh dear, oh dear." The energy field screamed apart with a sound like tearing flesh. The thing that stepped through wasn't like the others. Compact, segmented, a nightmare of chitinous plates jagged as broken obsidian. Its limbs ended in serrated pincers that clicked rhythmically. Click, 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 like a death watch beetle counting down its prey's last moments. It had no eyes, just a single rat orb embedded in its faceless head, pulsing faintly in time with my rabbit-quick heartbeat. "What is that?" Sarah choked out, backing away instinctively. Reeves said nothing. For once, his face stripped bare, pupils blown wide, lips trembling faintly as though he'd forgotten how to form words. The creature tilted its head toward me, its crimson orb flared brighter as it spoke. Not with sound, but with something far worse. "You are different." The words weren't in my head. They were under my skin, slithering through muscle and bone to nest deep within my marrow. Mechanical, yet alive. cold yet hungry, a child peeling wings off flies for amusement. I staggered back reflexively. "Stay the hell away," I snarled hoarsely. Sarah lunged forward without hesitation, swinging a bony fist at its nearest limb. "Don't touch him!" The creature didn't blink, couldn't blink. Its pincer lashed out faster than I could process, swatting her aside like a rag doll. She slammed into the ground with a sickening crunch. "Sarah!" I shouted, lurching toward her before freezing under the weight of its gaze. "Show us more." Granddad's voice roared in my skull. Pressures, just fear leaving the body. "No!" I spat through bloody teeth. My defiance felt hollow against its presence, but burned hot all the same. The orb flared brighter. Surprise? Rage? Before it lunged forward with pincers splayed wide. Its light consumed me entirely. I wasn't in the cell anymore. I was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere within my own mind. The garage warped into existence around me. Oil-stained concrete beneath my knees. Fluorescent lights flickering overhead like a stuttering film reel. Tools scattered across the workbench. But wrong now. So wrong. Wrenches coiled into spinal cords. Screwdrivers twisted into corkscrew larvae that writhed faintly against rusted metal surfaces. Younger me knelt by Granddad's old pickup truck, hands bloody as they wrestled with a rusted bolt that refused to turn. "Turn it!" Granddad's voice boomed from nowhere, but it wasn't his voice anymore. It was cold now, alien, vibrating through my molars as if spoken directly into bone marrow. The truck's hood rippled suddenly, metal melting into flesh as rows of jagged teeth split open along its surface, like some grotesque maw gnashing hungrily at empty air. Its headlights blinked slowly. Eyes, human eyes, dilating with terror too real to be imagined. Then, it screamed, a wet gurgling shriek that liquefied my bowels and sent ice racing down my spine. "Turn it!" The alien voice thundered again as younger me heaved against the bolt desperately, veins bulging until it snapped clean off in his hands. "No!" I screamed aloud, not in fear, but fury, as I raked clawed fingers down my face hard enough to draw blood. Reality fractured around me like shattered glass underfoot before snapping back into place violently. I was back in the cell now, or what was left of it. The energy shield sputtered erratically like a rabid animal on its last legs before collapsing entirely into silence, punctuated only by labored breathing and distant echoes reverberating through unseen corridors beyond our prison walls. Then, the creature vanished. "Well done," Reeves whispered. I wheezed. "What was that?" "A lesson," Reeves murmured, his voice reverent. "You've etched your name into their hive mind. Now they'll hunger for you, or fear you." Sarah limped closer. "Which is it?" she asked, her voice tight with pain. Reeves tilted his head back toward the ceiling, where shadows writhed like maggots in rotting flesh. His grin widened into something grotesque. "Both," he breathed, "and neither survives contact with interesting." The cell trembled violently, the floor undulating beneath us like spasming muscle. Bioluminescent veins along the walls flickered erratically, their light dimming to a sickly gray. Sarah slumped, cradling her arm tighter, her lips parted in a shallow gasp. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice trembling but etched with accusation. "I pushed back," I muttered through clenched teeth, swiping blood from my mouth with the back of my hand. My legs quivered beneath me, threatening to buckle under the weight of exhaustion and adrenaline. Reeves chuckled softly. "Oh, you ruptured them," he said. "Their hive mind thrives on order. You're the disruption of that order." The walls convulsed. A guttural moan reverberated through the cell, not mechanical, but organic, like vocal cords stretched too tight and vibrating with pain. The ship itself seemed to groan under the strain. Ethan rocked violently in his corner now, his fingernails carving crescents into his scalp as he whimpered incoherently. "Angry, angry, 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 angry." "Not anger," Reeves purred, his voice low and almost amused. He crouched slightly, as if listening to an unseen melody in the chaos around us. "Terror." The energy field surrounding the cell died with a wet pop, collapsing into itself like a punctured lung and leaving the entrance gaping. A black maw opening into the ship's pulsating gullet. Sarah stiffened beside me, her knuckles whitening where she gripped her injured arm. "That's not good," she said quietly. "Not good?" I echoed hoarsely, my gaze fixed on the corridor beyond, where walls seemed to breathe in slow, rhythmic pulses. "Isn't this our shot to escape?" Reeves's grin faded for the first time since I'd met him. His expression turned grim as he stepped toward the threshold and peered into the darkness beyond. "They're hurting you," he said softly, almost to himself. He turned back toward me. "Drop the gates," he continued in a whisper that felt too loud. "Let the lamb wander." He gestured toward the corridor with a skeletal hand. "Right, to the slaughterhouse." Sarah gripped my arm. "Don't, it's a trap." A low rumble shook the air around us. Deep, resonant, alive. "Coming," Ethan whimpered from his corner. His voice spiraled into a frantic chant. "Coming, coming, coming!" Reeves looked back at us abruptly. His lips curved into that familiar, unsettling grin. "Shall we witness history, children?" he asked lightly, his tone almost mocking. I hesitated for half a heartbeat before stepping into the corridor. The walls pressed closer as we moved forward, their veined surfaces glistening and sticky to the touch. The veins pulsed faintly beneath my fingertips when I brushed against them, warm and rhythmic, like blood coursing through arteries. Sarah followed behind me. I glanced back at her briefly. "Stay close," I said quietly. Reeves trailed behind us at a leisurely pace, humming tunelessly under his breath as though entirely unaffected by the oppressive atmosphere. His eyes darted occasionally to the walls as if he were studying them, cataloging their movements like a scientist observing an experiment. Ethan's voice chased us from behind as he stayed huddled in his corner. "Watching, always watching." The path ahead defied physics. Ceilings inverted, floors bulging into domes. Gravity lurched violently, yanking us sideways into a cavernous chamber that seemed to breathe around us. Sarah froze mid-step, her breath catching audibly in her throat. Spires, dozens of them, translucent obelisks oozing amber fluid. They stretched upward like grotesque stalagmites, their surfaces slick with condensation that dripped in rhythmic plinks onto the pulsating floor. "Are those?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "People," Reeves answered flatly. "Or their husks." I stepped forward. The nearest spire throbbed faintly under my gaze. Its surface warmed to the touch when I reached out instinctively. Inside the spire was a figure, its limbs stretched taut, tendons visible through translucent skin that shimmered like wet plastic. Its skull elongated, jaw unhinged in a silent scream that seemed eternal. "What are they doing to them?" I asked hoarsely, my stomach churning. Reeves stepped closer, pressing a palm against the spire's surface with disturbing familiarity. "They must be harvesting them," he said softly, almost reverently. "For what?" I asked. "For everything," he said simply. "Memories, emotions, consciousness itself." His finger traced the figure's distorted face through the glass as though studying a work of art. "This is what happens when the hive digests you." A low rumble sounded through the chamber. The spires trembled violently as the rumble crescendoed. Their amber fluid sloshed against their glass walls, which quivered under growing pressure. "Move!" Sarah hauled me backward by my arm. I stood paralyzed for a moment too long. The nearest spire's fluid drained with a wet gurgle, leaving its occupant suspended in void black air. Its body twitched violently before its eyelids peeled open with an audible snap. Milky orbs swiveled unnaturally to fix on me. It screamed. 1,000 voices, men, women, children, braided into a single shriek that drilled into my skull like jagged glass. Reeves pressed a hand to the shuddering wall as though savoring its vibrations. "The hive stirs its soldiers," he murmured. The figure convulsed violently within its shattered prison, its jaw unhinged further into a cavernous maw lined with needle-like teeth that clicked together hungrily. Around us, glass exploded in rapid succession. spires birthing horrors in grotesque marionette strides. Their limbs bent backward at impossible angles. Their faces were smeared into rictus grins of agony and hunger. Sarah grabbed me by the wrist and yanked hard enough to jolt me into motion. "Run!" she screamed. We careened into a corridor that seemed alive, the walls expanding and contracting like lungs struggling for air. Behind us came the pack's screeches, a staccato click-clatter of bone on chitin that echoed endlessly through the twisting passageways. "They're hurting us," Reeves hissed from somewhere ahead of me. His silhouette flickered briefly through a jagged archway. "Here!" We burst into another chamber, larger than any we'd seen before and humming with an alien rhythm that vibrated through my chest like a second pulse. Massive organs pulsed within glassine sacks suspended from above. Tendrils coiled around pillars etched with runes that squirmed nauseatingly under my gaze. Sarah doubled over beside me. "What is this?" she gasped between heaving breaths. "The heart," Reeves said simply as he pressed his palm against a throbbing membrane near one of the pillars. His eyes gleamed with manic fascination, or perhaps a tumor. Before I could respond or even process his words, the horde flooded through the entrance behind us, their twisted faces smeared into grotesque grins. Their limbs bent backward as they scuttled spider-like across walls and ceilings alike. Reeves whirled toward me suddenly, his eyes wild and manic now. "Disrupt them," he shouted over their voices. "Your mind's a scalpel. Cut the threat." "How?" I yelled back helplessly as panic clawed at my throat. Sarah grabbed my arm tightly enough to draw blood with her nails. Her voice cracked with desperation. "Do whatever the hell you did before." Granddad's voice detonated in my skull like thunder. "Pressure's just fear leaving the body." I slammed both hands onto the nearest machine without thinking. It shrieked under my touch, warm and wet like living flesh recoiling from fire. Its surface blistered where my skin met it. I closed my eyes, oil-stained hands guiding a wrench. Sawdust motes drifting lazily in afternoon light. Granddad's laugh, smoke rough and endless. The machine bucked violently beneath my hands as though alive, and then reality itself stuttered. Reeves's laughter spiraled upward into hysteria behind me. "Yes!" White light consumed everything. Then, silence. I blinked my eyes, a vision swimming in grey. The chamber lay entombed in a fine layer of dust. The figures in the spires were gone, reduced to cinder shapes that crumbled in a non-existent wind. Machinery hung limp and lifeless, its sacks deflated like rotten fruit left to rot. "You broke the song," Reeves whispered. "What song?" I rasped. "The hymn of the hive," he said simply, toe poking a drift of ash at his feet. For now. Ash hung like a pall in the air, gritty between my teeth and clouding my eyelashes. "You're no longer cattle, boy," he said evenly. "You're rabies." He gestured broadly to the chamber around us, the twitching walls and spasming veins that pulsed erratically like a failing heartbeat. "And the hurt once you put down." The chamber twitched. Bioluminescent veins lining the wall spasmed violently, their light strobing in uneven bursts like a dying star gasping its last breath. Sarah stiffened beside me, her gaze darting toward the trembling walls. "What's happening?" she asked sharply. "Recomposition," Reeves said matter-of-factly. "The hive's stitching itself back into harmony." "But how? I thought I broke them," I argued desperately, my voice rising above the growing din of wet gurgles and groans echoing through the chamber. "You broke a single note in an endless chorus," Reeves replied with a grin that split his face wide open. "But oh," he added, "how they'll hate you for it." The walls rippled, their flash-like surfaces undulating as though alive. Sarah staggered, her face pale but determined. "We need to move," she said. Reeves spread his arms wide, his grin manic. "To movement then, let the opus crescendo," he declared, his voice reverberating unnaturally in the trembling chamber. The corridors had straightened into gullets now, walls ripped with cartilage, ceilings dripped mucus that plopped onto the floor in wet splatters. Our footsteps echoed too loud, too rhythmic, as if the ship itself marched us toward some unseen stage. "They're optimizing," Reeves murmured with unsettling fascination. His eyes gleamed as he watched the shadows shift, pruning inefficiencies. "They're cornering us," Sarah snapped, her voice tight with fear. Granddad's voice growled in my skull. "Pressures, just fear leaving the body." But this wasn't fear. It was fury now, white-hot and jagged. I clenched my fists and muttered under my breath, "Let them choke on it." The corridor vomited us into a cathedral of horrors. Pots, hundreds of them. They hung from the ceiling like grotesque womb fruit, translucent sacks filled with bioluminescent amniotic fluid glowing a sickly septic green. Inside each pot, figures floated in nightmarish suspension, limbs stretched to snapping points, jaws dislocated into impossible angles, skin translucent as latex stretched over thrashing organs that pulsed faintly beneath. Sarah gagged audibly. "Are they alive?" she asked weakly. "Alive enough," Reeves said without emotion. His gaze swept over the pots with clinical detachment. "Clay for their new song." I stepped closer to one of the pots, despite every instinct screaming at me to stay away. The figure inside turned its head, too far, too smooth, and smiled at me with needle-thin teeth that glistened in the green light. Its eyes were gone, replaced by bioluminescent nodules that pulsed in perfect sync with the hive's rhythm. "Why keep them like this?" I asked hoarsely, bile rising in my throat. "Raw material," Reeves replied as he tapped on the pot's surface with one bony finger. The thing inside shivered at his touch, consciousness stripped to base impulses. Fear, hunger, hate, efficient, pure. A hiss broke through the chamber, a dozen valves releasing steam in unison. The pots quaked violently as their fluids sloshed within. Needle-tipped umbilical cords detached with wet snaps. "They're awake," Sarah shouted as she yanked me backward just as the nearest pot split, birthing its occupant in a gush of fetid fluid. Reeves closed his eyes and swayed slightly on his feet, his arms spread wide like a man preparing an orchestra for its opening note. "Ah, the conductor arrives," he murmured. The chamber breathed. From the shadows emerged a towering marionette of knotted tendrils, black as event horizons and just as infinite. Its head swiveled unnaturally, a single crimson orb burning at its core like a dying star collapsing inward on itself. The air around it curdled instantly, thick and electric with ozone and something fouler. Decay made manifest. Tendrils unfurled from its body, liquid and infinite, fractaling outward until they anchored themselves to walls, ceiling, reality itself. They stitched into the ship's flesh like veins feeding a cancerous organ. "Alex?" Sarah gripped my arm tightly. Her voice was raw with desperation. "Do something." Reeves stood amidst the chaos like a prophet welcoming divine wrath. "Survival," he called out over the din of groaning walls and rupturing veins, "is the sharpest note of all." The conductor loomed before me now, a living nightmare of tendrils branching infinitely outward, its crimson orb pulsing erratically like a failing heartbeat. Shadows twisted unnaturally around it. Jagged lines of light cut through the air like knives, slicing reality apart piece by piece. My vision fractured into kaleidoscope charts, 1,000 realities overlapping where the conductor existed in all iterations at once. "Alex!" Sarah screamed again, her voice frayed and desperate as blood streaked her face where collapsing walls had grazed her skin. Reeves stepped forward then, his arms spread wide like a martyr embracing his fate. "Magnificent," he breathed reverently as he stared into the conductor's orb. "A symphony of..." A tendril snapped out faster than thought, a blur of obsidian that struck Reeves mid-chest with bone-crunching force. He folded instantly under its impact, ribs crunched audibly as he hurtled across the chamber and slammed into a pot with shattering force. Glass exploded outward, amber fluid gushed onto the floor around his broken frame. Sarah screamed, "Do something!" Granddad's voice detonated again in my skull. "Pressures, just fear leaving the body." I stepped closer despite every nerve. The conductor's presence bit into me, 1,000 needles plunging deep into bone marrow. But I reached deeper still, oil-stained hands guiding mine over rusted bolts, sawdust motes drifting lazily in golden light. The garage's rusted skeleton standing defiant against time itself. The hive's rhythm stuttered. The conductor recoiled violently. Its tendrils spasmed erratically as though struck by an unseen force. Cracks splintered across its crimson orb like ice fracturing under a hammer. A keening wail tore through the chamber, not mechanical but organic, born from some dark place between stars where no light had ever touched. The ship convulsed around us, violently now, walls puckering inward before rupturing outward. Veins burst open to spew phosphorescent pus across every surface. The hive mind's chorus fractured entirely into dissonant shrieks, a galaxy of voices unraveling all at once. Sarah yanked me backward just as the conductor began to unmake itself, tendrils dissolving into black mist that reeked of burnt synapses and decay. Reeves stirred weakly in the wreckage nearby. His laughter was wet and broken, but unmistakable as he coughed out, "Oof!" He dragged himself upright painfully. One arm hung limp at his side, where bone jutted through torn skin. "The heart, it's collapsing." The floor liquefied, swallowing pots whole. Ceilings rained shards of chitin that shattered like brittle bones. We fled down corridors that melted around us, their once straight paths now twisting intestines constricting tighter with every step. Finally, we stumbled into a small chamber lined with sleek pots. Escape vessels grown from the ship itself, their surfaces glistening like wet skin stretched over bone. "Get in," Reeves barked, shoving me and Sarah toward one of the pots. "What about you?" I asked, gripping Sarah's arm as I helped her inside. Reeves smiled faintly. His eyes glinted with something unreadable. Pride? Resignation? Madness? "I've played my part," he said simply. "Now it's your turn." Before I could argue, he slammed the pot door shut and activated its launch sequence. The chamber shuddered as the pot sealed itself around us, a flashy cocoon ejecting into the void. Through the viewport, we watched as the ship collapsed in on itself, a dying leviathan folding inward like paper consumed by flame. Its bioluminescent veins flared one last time, a final pulse of defiance, and then winked out. The pot hummed, a sound like Granddad's old rotary saw biting into steel as it carved through the void. Earth hung ahead, a blue-green bubble suspended in infinite black. Beautiful, fragile, ignorant. Pressures just fear leaving the body. Granddad's mantra curdled into my skull. He'd never mentioned what fear leaves behind. The scars it carves into your soul. The psychic rot that festers long after survival. When I closed my eyes, I saw them. The conductor's fractal tendrils birthing horrors like Russian dolls. Reeves' smile as he disappeared into chaos, triumphant and devoured. The pot cratered into a Kansas wheat field with a deafening crash, steam hissing from its carapace as it cooled under an indifferent sun. Cows lowed distantly. Cicadas sang their endless dirge. Normalcy itself felt grotesque. We clambered out on shaking legs, knees sinking into loam damp with morning dew. Sarah collapsed immediately to her hands and knees, her fingers playing in the dirt as if testing its reality. I tilted my face to the sun, warm and human, but it felt thin somehow, filtered through something I couldn't name. We slept in that field for 3 days. Granddad was half right. Fear leaves the body, but it nests in your soul and sings forever.